what exactly is this society in which Maryam grows up?
I think, like most people, I've always had a very vague idea or concept of the society being at the very least, being very patriarch orientated.
Okay.
Especially if you read the Bible going into the Old Testament. But for this week, I wanted to do deeper research and get more concrete evidences or points of references regarding the society, because we know that, she was a female dedicated to the temple, which wasn't normally allowed for females. And so we see, especially if we're looking for strictly an Islamic perspective between the Quran and Hadith or the tafsir, that it seems to have been a mixture, in that there was this patriarch-orientated society, sometimes worst case scenario patriarchal, and yet there was the support for her, and that's quite interesting. And so we through history we can start getting ideas as to why that was. So to look at her background, we look at Banī Isrāījl within the context of history. We look at the fact that at that time they were more than likely colonized by the Roman imperialists. But before that, they were colonized in about 330 BCE by Alexander the Macedonian, and he colonized not just them, but throughout the Middle East, going right through India, and pretty much Hellenized the world. So he influenced people in terms of the religion, the class system, but there were also some superficial materialistic benefits. But to then appreciate how the Greeks may have influenced the people of that time in terms of gender studies, because now we're looking at this as from a gender perspective, we look at the rights of Greek women in ancient times, just to give you a rough idea of the societal norms. So apparently ancient Greek women were not allowed to have an education. Back then, from ages 7 to 18, they had to get married. If they weren't married by 18, then they were sold off as slavery or went into prostitution. And so also, if the woman had a child, then it was for the father to decide whether to keep the child or not. If the child was a female, then he could make the decision to put the child on top of the mountaintop and just leave the child there. So this definitely reminds you of a certain other group, doesn't it?
It definitely does.
It's a pagan tradition that denotes a lack of taqwa, basically, because the man is considering that this is my child. The child belongs to me. The woman and the children belong to me. They're seen as possessive. They're not seen as trusts. They're not seen as actually the woman and the child belong to someone else, and they're entrusted to me. I'm therefore accountable for the woman and the children. My authority is dependent on my accountability to take care of the woman and the children. But instead, you find in ancient times how predominant this was, like whether this is 80% of the situation or 50%, it's enough to be a problem and to spread and to have long-term effects even up until today. You see, even in our Western civilization today, there is this influence of men thinking that they own and possess women and children, instead of thinking of them as trusts that they are accountable for.
Yes, of course.
So there's definitely that issue to be considered. Both the Greeks and the Romans had a lot in common. So if you look at their architecture, you look at their art, their styles throughout the ancient world, there's a lot of similarities with the pillars and the statues. Their mythology is very similar. Their diet and their dress is also very similar. I think the Romans took a lot from the Greeks, in my opinion. Allah knows best, but I think the one culture definitely influenced the other one a lot more. What they basically had in common initially is that they both live by the Mediterranean Sea, so they both have naval access. Okay, so that's gonna what that is going to do is that's going to help them in terms of trade, which is definitely going to propel and help their civilizations grow. And they have amazing climates. So in terms of agriculture, they've got that advantage. So it's not surprising that with the trade and the influences of other civilizations, especially African Egypt, that they would prosper and grow as a people, as a nation.
That makes sense,
Yes. So, alhamdulillah, this is why we say alhamdulillah, because our prosperity as a people is always based on the environment and a lot of internal and external influences. See, but instead, unfortunately, people, they become very arrogant and they start to assume that they are the reason that they are successful and have leverage over others. So another thing that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans have in common is that they would cultivated racial science. So they didn't go into terms like black and white back then, But they used to write, and they used to have these theories that, like, people in the north, because they believe that the climate affected people in terms of their intelligence and their strength.
Okay.
So they believe that people in the north, for example, the Barbary, so Barbary means foreigner, but as you can see that the name came to me, like barbarian means that you're rough, you're rugged,
yes.
you're uncivilized,
yeah.
you understand? So my ancestors, the Celts and the Vikings, they were the Barbaries of the north, and they were very strong people because it was cold, and so they had to work harder. But they were not considered very intelligent. They were considered very vulgar people. Yeah. Okay. And then the people of the south, like, for example, the Egyptians were considered to be more intellectual, but they were considered to be more lazy because of the heat.
Okay.
So that's how they, but they also contradicted themselves as well regarding the people of the south and the people of the north.
Okay.
And then they believed that they were the perfect people, that they were both the smartest and the strongest people. And therefore were justified to colonize everybody else. Okay. So this is another legacy that we see persisting up until today. Not just colonization of the world leading to racism and apartheid and so on and so forth. But while I was doing this research, I was actually watching a movie called Vice. I don't normally watch movies, but it happened to come on. It was about Dick Cheney because he was very much behind the invasions of Iraq after 9/11.
Okay.
And that psychology comes into it.
Yes.
This attitude of entitlement to invasively take over because there's an assumed superiority. So that theme is very much repeating itself throughout history. And interestingly enough, they spoke about Banī Isrāījl in their reports, and they said that Banī Isrāījl, the Jews at the time, were actually known to be very anti-materialistic and anti-money, which is interesting because there's a stereotype that's being pushed that contradicts that.
Yes.
The quote-unquote Jewish banker, that's now being pushed. But at the time, the Jewish people were known to be anti-materialistic, and they were very wary of coins.
Okay.
They're very worried because the Greeks actually introduced the monetary system because the Banī Isrāījl used to do a lot of bartering, and then when the Greeks colonized them, they introduced the coins.
Yes.
And a lot of the Banī Isrāījl were actually quite wary of this, of the system, because they were worried that it was going to corrupt them, which is unfortunately interesting because it's happened to the whole of humanity in a variety of ways. So basically, the Greeks colonized Banī Isrāījl and definitely had some influence on them, which we're going to discuss later, inshallah. But after their collapse and revolts, the Romans followed suit, and the Romans were considered to be more ravenous than the Greeks.
Okay.
But now the question is how did the Romans start? How did Roman civilization start? So now I'm going to have to tell the cringing story of that. I really don't like telling this story, but anyhow, alhamdulillah. So according to most historians and storytellers about ancient Rome, there was a tribe where a chief was overthrown by his brother. The daughter of the dethroned chief was put in the temple to serve as a Vestal Virgin, but then Mars, quote-unquote deity, came down, got her pregnant against her will, and she gave birth to twins called Remus and Romulus. Her uncle was a bad guy, took the twins, put them in a basket, put them down the river, where she will found them and then nurse them until Shepherd came and gave them to his wife, and then she continued to nurse them. The boys grew up. They cultivated a band of men, like merry men, to fight with them in the forest or what have you, and they overthrew their uncle and they reclaimed the kingdom and gave it to, basically appointed another man as ruler, and then got property for themselves. Okay, so obviously a lot of that story is nonsense. But just the fact that it keeps being told and is accepted as normal is problematic in itself, and I think it reflects a lot of the, societal attitudes.
Okay.
So anyhow, it gets more interesting in some ways. So the two brothers, because they were twins and the one wasn't older than the other, they had a dispute as ways to build on their property, and they started to clash and they fought. The one brother killed the other. Romulus killed Remus in the fight. Okay, so now he's a murderer after killing his brother, and with his men he established his